Great. Again, my name is Mike Dean. I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause Minnesota. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit government watchdog group. After a week-long investigation, Common Cause has uncovered a scheme by Minnesota's Future Political Fund in committee, the Republican Governors Association, to avoid key aspects of Minnesota's disclosure law by funneling $428,000 contribution through a shell corporation. Today, 3 separate complaints were filed with against each organization with the Minnesota Campaign Finance Disclosure Board. The complaints allege that the 3 groups together violated numerous state statutes ranging from circumvention of campaign finance laws, failing to register as a political committee, and failing to report receipts and expenditures. The 3 groups could face a $5.1 million civil penalty and criminal prosecution. So this is an extremely serious violation. Part of this is from the new law, new disclosure law that passed earlier this year. Part of it is existing campaign finance law. The scheme that was created was clear and deliberate attempt by Minnesota's Future and the Republican Governors Association to avoid Minnesota's source disclosure law. This case should send a clear message that independent expenditures cannot circumvent the law and that those that violate the law will face severe penalties. So what I'd like to do is kind of walk you through the complaint. Everyone has the information. There's a lot there, but let's just kind of walk it through, and then as you have questions, just feel free to throw them out. So just to be clear, there's 3 organizations basically involved. The first is Minnesota's Future Political Fund, which is a registered political fund with the Campaign Finance Disclosure Board. The chair of that group is Chris Tiedemann. He's a former member of the Republican National Committee and was Mitt Romney's steering committee in Minnesota. Joe Dugsma is the treasurer of that group and was also the 2006 treasurer for Michelle Bachmann's campaign. The second group involved is the Republican Governors Association. I'm sure you're all familiar with them, that they work to elect Republican governors across the country, and Haley Barbour is currently their chair. And then the third organization is Minnesota's Future LLC, which is a limited liability corporation registered with the Secretary of State's office. It's again a separate entity from Minnesota's Future Political Fund. The leader of that organization is Jeff Larson. Jeff Larson is a veteran Republican operative who has worked with Norm Coleman. So how did this scheme take place? Let's talk about it and where the evidence, where we uncovered the evidence. First off, on August 11, 2010, a shell corporation, Minnesota's Future LLC, was created and when it filed articles of organization with the Secretary of State's office. And that's the articles right here. So with the articles, you can see here they list their primary purpose. And their primary purpose is basically engaging in political activities. And that's a key part of the evidence here. So they say that, quote, they accept contributions and make independent expenditures to directly or indirectly influence the selection, nomination, election, or appointment of any individual to public office. The Campaign Finance Disclosure Board requires that any group who has a primary purpose of political activities needs to register with them. And so what should have happened is this organization, Minnesota Future LLC, should have registered with the Campaign Finance Disclosure Board. So the second phase of this scheme was basically then on August 25th, the Shell Corporation received a $428,000 contribution from the Republican Governors Association. Immediately, that same day, $390,000 out of that bank account from Minnesota Future LLC was then transferred to Minnesota's Future Political Fund. So all this information, again, is outlined in the Minnesota's Future Political Committee report, which was filed on September 22nd, 2010, and is available online. So the question is, where did they break the law? And what are we alleging? So Minnesota state law prohibits groups from attempting to circumvent requirements of Chapter 10A by redirecting a contribution through or making a contribution on behalf of another individual or association. And that's Minnesota State Statute 10A.29. And that's exactly what they did. What they did is they funneled the money from the Republican Governors Association to the LLC, and then the money moved immediately to the political fund. And in doing so, they were trying to avoid Minnesota's source disclosure law. And this is part of the new law that passed earlier this year that requires any entity that receives money from an association to disclose the source of that contribution. So what should have happened is when the Republican Governors Association gave the money, they were required to actually fill out a source disclosure information and disclose where that $428,000 came from. And by not doing so, they broke the law. So let's talk about sort of how we sort of put this together. There's a few reasons in which we believe that circumvention occurred. First is the timing of the transactions. Most of this happened on the very same day. The LLC was only created a mere 2 weeks before the money was transferred. Two, the commonality of the names. Minnesota's Future Political Fund, Minnesota's Future LLC. Very similar, so it shows some collusion between the organizations. Also the fact that LLC was created just, again, a few days before the contribution came through. Also the fact that Minnesota's Future LLC's stated purpose is to accept contributions directly or indirectly to influence the election of any individual for office. So it shows they have that political concept in nature. And then also the near identical nature of the transactions of pretty much around that $428,000 was moved directly through the organizations. And so this leads us to the conclusion that Minnesota's Future LLC acted as an intermediary for the purpose really of circumventing that source disclosure law that we mentioned. So here's kind of all the examples specifically. This is the report filed with the Campaign Finance Disclosure Board that shows the money coming to Minnesota's Future Political Fund all came from basically Minnesota's Future LLC. The first transfer was on 8/25. That's the same day when the RGA contribution was received, and then they transferred additional amounts on the 2nd of September and the 14th of September. So that $390,000 then came from right here. And this is the source disclosure that was filed with the report. And this is how we know where the money came from. But again, it's required under state law that they actually use this LLC as an intermediary to circumvent the money. And technically, they should have filled out a source disclosure form for the Republican Governors Association. And the RGA then needed to disclose where all its contributions came from. So let's walk through all the other violations. Once they circumvented the law, it created a chain reaction, basically where they violated a series of additional laws. The first is that Minnesota's, let's go through Minnesota's Future LLC. There's 4 laws that they basically broke. First is that they failed to register as a political committee. They clearly are required to do so because, again, their primary purpose as an organization is to engage in political activity. The board clearly requires that a group do that. Also, as soon as that they receive a contribution or an expenditure in excess of $100, they're immediately required to register. And as we saw through the disclosure forms earlier, that happened on August 25th or August 24th. The second is the failure to report the receipts and expenditures. With this, they failed to then also fill out a 42-day pre-general election report that's required under the law. The third area then is accepting a contribution from the RGA without that proper disclosure. So again, they should have filled out a source disclosure form as part of that. As you see here on this chart, it sort of outlines what are all the penalties associated with these. So there are a wide variety of penalties. The most severe is the one I just mentioned, with accepting a contribution from the Republican Governors Association without proper disclosure. By failing to disclose that, state law basically allows for a penalty up to 4 times the amount that was not disclosed. So what we did there is we took the $428,000 times 4, and that's the maximum amount of the penalty that could be assessed against this organization. And that's how we get it with all 3 organizations too. So this could be one of the largest fines ever brought down by the Campaign Finance Disclosure Board if they're found guilty of all these offenses, and it could be around, again, that $5.1 million scenario. The other part of this, and going back to the circumvention law, is that there are aspects where there could be criminal proceedings too. And some of these are actually considered gross misdemeanors, mainly the circumvention law, but then also the failure to filing a false report or a false statement. So let's go to the second organization, Minnesota's Future Political Committee. They've circumvented the law, the disclosure law. They've accepted a contribution from the RGA. Again, very similar complaint without disclosing it. And then they actually filed a false statement with the Campaign Finance Report, or Campaign Finance Board. And then the last is with the Republican Governors Association. And what the RGA should have done, not only did they circumvent the law, but they failed to disclose that original source funds that's required under Minnesota Campaign Finance law. So this is all laid out clearly in a 40-page complaint that we filed against each organization. You can feel free to use that to sort of answer questions. With that, what we have done is, because of the heinous nature of this activity, we've asked the Campaign Finance Board to move through an expedited process because we think it's really important that not only this be stopped and this clear message be sent to other independent expenditure groups that this is not okay, but then also so that we have clarification in the law. I mean, some of the aspects here are new aspects of the law, and I think that it needs to be clarified then too. But we believe in reading the law that we have, there's proper evidence for the Campaign Finance Disclosure Board to move forward with the case and actually, again, find them guilty of these violations. So with that, why don't I open up for any questions?
Why didn't you file one against Wynn, Minnesota and the Democratic Governors Association?
They did not commit the same crime.
If they reported it exactly the same way.
No, they're very different.
Different?
They're very different organizations. So there's a few ways in which they're different. And let me just sort of clarify. What we've done is we've reviewed all the campaign finance reports from those three major organizations and chatted with different experts out there sort of comparing what is legal and what is not legal. First off, in how they're different is the LLC and Minnesota's Future Political Fund are both registered as 527 organizations. Wynn, Minnesota is not. In terms of what they're referring to. Wynn, Minnesota is actually a C4 organization. And so because of that, its primary purpose is actually not to influence elections. A C4 organization can't. They would be held in violation of tax status if a C4 organization's primary purpose was for political. And again, you have to understand how political is defined though. Political, there's political advocacy that exists, but then the way that the board defines it, the Campaign Finance Disclosure Board defines it, it's actually influencing election. And so as a C4 organization, it's required by federal law, it cannot spend more than 50% of its income to actually influence an election. And so that makes them very different first off. The second is that really, the organization is different, that it's actually been around for a lot longer. So my understanding is Wynn, Minnesota, by pulling the GuideStar report, has been around since 2007. Whereas with the LLC was literally created 2 weeks before this whole transaction happened. Also, you'll see the third reason why it's different is that Minnesota's Future LLC has basically no other activity besides this contribution. If you look at Wynn, Minnesota's reports over the last 3 years, it's had a lot of different transactions to a lot of different organizations. I believe some C4 organizations, various other organizations. So it's not clear that there's a direct sort of pass-through that we see with this because, again, of the information where basically LLC only has received money so far from the Republican Governors Association.
But Wynn, Minnesota didn't disclose, the Democratic Governors Association didn't disclose the source of their money when they gave it to Wynn, Minnesota.
That's correct. But again, they weren't trying to circumvent the law because of all these other things. Wynn, Minnesota acts as basically a C4 type of organization. It's sort of my reading of this, where, again, with a 527, that's totally different. And the money didn't really sort of pass through it. By having a broader mission, then, too, it's very different. Because, again, organization, it is legal for a C4 organization to take this type of money. And that's sort of the way that the law currently works, to sort of take the money and give it to other organizations. And again, there's not that sort of clear pass-through with the contribution when we reviewed the Wynn, Minnesota funds.
I don't understand. Are you trying to say they concealed the money because the $428,000 is reported on the political funds filing with the Campaign Finance Board?
Correct, but they didn't do the source disclosure, which is what's required under the law.
So it's not required for the DGA?
Again, it's a different scenario.
Primarily because you're saying because it's registered as a 527 rather than, or as a C4
Yes.
rather than a 527 under the IRS tax law, they don't have to adhere to Minnesota's disclosure?
No, that's not what I'm saying. What it is that basically Wynn, Minnesota handled this contribution in the proper way, and the 527 Minnesota Future LLC did not. Because for the very reasons that I mentioned earlier, of the organization was created basically 2 weeks just before. Its primary purpose and its only primary activity so far has been to accept this money. If you look at Wynn, Minnesota and what it's done over the last few years, it has a very broad purpose and is very different than in the LLC. I mean, it's clear when you look at this that the Minnesota's Future was created just for the sole purpose of funneling this money.
How can you say that the Wynn, Minnesota is not trying to influence an election?
No, they are. But again...
And the Democratic governors give money to them so they can influence the election.
Correct. But again, under Minnesota law, it allows certain type of contributions to move through in certain ways. And Wynn, Minnesota followed the law in my reading of it. And Minnesota's Future LLC did not.
And is this a clerical error? Is this just a technical thing, something really minute that
No.
we're talking about here?
No, because I believe that there was clear intent to avoid the disclosure law here. They went out of their way to create an entire new organization a mere 2 weeks before the contribution was put together. You did not see that with Win Minnesota. Win Minnesota, again, has existed for 3 years beforehand. So by creating it 2 weeks before, it shows me that there was clear intent to try to avoid the source disclosure law.
Yet they did disclose where the money came from in September,
Who?
Minnesota's Future.
Minnesota's Future, but again, they didn't disclose. There were many violations, but again, they did not disclose the source contribution.
And so by source contribution, do you mean the people who contributed to the Republican Governors
Yes.
Association? So we have to have 100,000 $4 contributors here?
It depends. I mean, Minnesota law sort of walks you through. This is part of the new statute, 10A27, subsection 15, that we passed this year, that creates multiple scenarios in which basically an outside association has to do source disclosure. It can choose who it discloses, meaning that it can pick 5 contributors that all contributed $100,000 and then just kind of show that. Or if it's a membership association, it then has to sort of handle it a slightly different way with it.
So I'm confused here. If Minnesota's Future would have filed a C4, there would not be a problem.
No, that's not correct. Well, I mean, it depends. It's more complicated than that. Because when they created a C4, then they would no longer have had the primary purpose of trying to influence elections, unlike a 527. And so by doing that,
Future would have created a C4 and then moved that money over to the other Minnesota Future. That would have been fine.
yes, but they couldn't have moved all the money over. They could have technically moved half of the money over. Because again, going to the tax issues of 501c4 organizations, you're only allowed to contribute less than 50% of the money to influence the outcome of an election. So as a C4 organization, you have to have a larger purpose than just purely influencing elections. Because again, the tax code, has is very different between express advocacy and direct advocacy. And again, going back to, we've talked a lot about here lately, the National Organization for Marriage. Why has NOM not disclosed any of its information so far? Why has it not filled out campaign finance reports? It's because it's considered express advocacy under the law. And this is coming from, again, court precedent. The Supreme Court has basically considered there's 4 magic words that if you don't mention, you're considered express advocacy and you don't have to disclose. So I mean, yes, but they couldn't have still done exactly what they did because they would have had to contributed less than half. But had they...
Minnesota contributes less than half?
Yes, because they're a 501c4 organization.
Has
So
Cause looked into whether they indeed spend more than half their money on things other than trying to influence elections?
That's an issue in terms of the IRS. So you can only get that information once they file all their IRS statements, and that has not come out yet. So no, we have not been able to review it. I mean, I did review what's online through GuideStar right now. I think is the 2007 or 2008 documents. And so we reviewed that, and yes, the money goes to a wide variety of organizations. I mean, the key thing to think about is that Common Cause is a C4 organization. And so let's just sort of make that clear that, and so is Win Minnesota. And so you can be a C4 organization. What we try to do is not influence the outcome of election. We do express advocacy where we're supporting campaign finance reform issues. But we're still considered a C4 organization. Again, just like Win Minnesota. So it's a very sort of different beast, the 501c4 compared to the 527 and how they created it.
But if Win Minnesota is a C4, they're giving to an organization that's doing, direct advocacy, aren't they?
And they're allowed to do that as a 501c4 organization. They're limited in how much they can give, though, too. If Common Cause wanted to, under the tax laws, we could give money to endorse candidates. We choose not to because we're a nonpartisan organization, but we're allowed to under the 501c4 status.
And because of that, they don't have to disclose the sort of meta source of this LGA money?
Correct. Because of how they move the money through the system.
But you're supposed to stand for transparency. Don't you want them to also have to disclose where that came from?
Hey, if we want to talk about improving the campaign finance laws, I've been sending out press releases like crazy, and I'd love to. I mean, there's lots of loopholes right now in the system right now. The largest that we've been able to expose is the express advocacy loophole. And that's what would actually go right directly after this. We tried to pass a law that would have been included in the disclosure bill this session that would have required groups like NOM, and in this case actually Win Minnesota, that do express advocacy during the election period to disclose that type of information.
But it seems like in the end you have the same transparency between the two groups, because we have this 428,000 from RGA, and then on the Win Minnesota side and Alliance side, we can see the same money coming from the DGA. It seems like it's the same thing. One file is a different type of organization, as you're pointing out here. But transparency-wise, isn't it the same thing?
But the issue, though, is one organization followed the law and the other organization did not.
So that's the issue.
That's the issue. And again, the one organization that did not follow the law basically did it in a way where they actually were trying to circumvent the law sort of as written because of how they created the organization, because of the timing of the transaction, the almost near identical amounts of the transaction where it was clear. It's much more harder. You can't prove that case with Win Minnesota, basically, because so much other money is sort of coming and going that you can't say A to B to C. With this, there aren't that many contributions. There's literally one. If you look back to...
they filed as a 527 so that they could put all of their money into this direct effort.
Correct. The proper way to do this would have been Minnesota's future LLC should have been registered as a political fund with the state, with the Campaign Finance Disclosure Board. Had they done that, everything would be legal here.
Or a C4, and then give less money.
Or had they decided to be a C4 organization, that would have worked then too. But again, I want to be in the business of telling people how to find the loopholes in the system right now. I'm just trying to explain this is what the current law is. We're trying to improve it, but we're also exposing a current violation of the system, quite honestly, to basically create more pressure to push for larger reforms on this, which is the larger whole, which I believe is the express advocacy, which is groups allowing to basically engage in this sort of political activity without having to disclose the information.
What are those four magic words that we can't say to distinguish the two groups?
Vote for, vote against, and it's elect for and elect against, basically. And again, I think that was part of the Buckley v. Vallejo case that happened shortly after Watergate, basically. So again, LLC, had they registered as a political fund, they would have been fine. Once they had done that, though, they would have had to have filled out a source disclosure form for that RGA contribution.
And then they would have to show
where that money came from.
And that could be 4 $100,000 contributions.
Yes.
Or it could be a stack of $4 contributions.
Again, I can give you, we can read the law, but it's all sort of outlined. There's different scenarios depending on the organization. What we tried to do is when we created be a little bit more flexible for organizations, specifically, honestly, C4 membership organizations that are purely, to list all your members of an organization could be extremely burdensome.
Because presumably people don't give to the RGA saying, I want this to go to Minnesota, right? Or do they?
Some may. If that were the case, then they would have had to have actually disclosed that in that source disclosure. So let's say the Koch brothers said, I want $100,000 to go to Minnesota, and sort of directly put it there, that's what they would have had to disclose in the source contribution. Well, if there weren't anybody that had done that, then they could just pick people, whoever they chose, basically.
Why would they do it this way, and in your view, violating the law, if it's going to be disclosed anyway in a month? What was the urgency here?
I think it largely came off of the Target backlash. I think that if you notice the timing of this happened basically 3 weeks into the whole Target public backlash, where we saw immense public pressure being put on corporations that were involved in electoral politics. And they saw that happening and said, hey, we have to hide our donors because we don't want this information coming out. And even with the report that came out, they're still not doing the source disclosure. So that's what we're alleging here. So just to be clear on that. But they saw what happened with Target and wanted to figure out a way in which they did not have to disclose those source contributions.
So in your view, it's not a technical violation. This is a deliberate effort to conceal donors.
Yes. Because again, they went out of their way to create an LLC corporation to do that. The other way that this could have been legal is that RGA could have given money just to Minnesota's political committee. That's all they had to do. That would have been the easiest thing. But what they did is they went out of their way, created a special LLC to basically funnel the money through.
If they'd given directly to the committee, they would have had to disclose
the source contributions of the RGA dollars. Yep.
Do you think that there's corporate money in there?
From what we've seen through some of the other filings that the RGA has done, yes, there is.
And the RGA has to file on the federal level, like the FEC, right?
Correct, but one of the problems is, and why we've been pushing the Disclose Act at the federal level, is that the federal laws are extremely weak when it comes to this, in terms of the level of disclosure. Minnesota has much more sort of more information coming out when it comes to disclosure. So yes, some of that information will be disclosed down the road, but most of it actually won't come out till after the election, which is what we think is most harmful here, because the whole point in passing the disclosure law is so the public knows where the money is coming from and can make informed decisions based upon that.
I know you said there's a tax issue, but do you know anything else that Win Minnesota does exactly? I mean, what else that organization is used for?
I mean, I know that they give to, I mean, I can't specifically name the organizations. Let me see what I can find.
There's that other 2010 fund.
There is that 2010 fund, but from what I remember looking at their guide stars, that they give into a variety of other C4 organizations. I even think they've given to some C3 organizations. What they're doing, I'm not really sure, because again, in the guide star report, it just says this organization received that. But again, I mean, we looked at everyone here. We looked at Minnesota Forward, we looked at Minnesota's Future, we looked at Win Minnesota and sort of this scenario. And in the conversations we've had, this is the improper way to do it. And Win Minnesota did it legally. Now, we may not like it, but again, they did it the proper way. And again, I mean, my larger concern is that there was clear intent here to try to avoid the disclosure law.
But the amount of transparency is the same between the two sides. Transparency, forget the legal part of it, just whether we know who the donors are.
But I'm here to, I mean, Common Cause worked hard to pass the disclosure law, and we created a way where it needs to be followed. And right now it's not being followed, because groups are sort of creating these scenarios where they're funneling money through different organizations. And my worry is, say, well, hey, does it really matter? Then the answer to that is, then we're basically not enforcing the law. And so then it basically becomes useless to us. Because if you start not enforcing this part, why do we need to enforce other aspects of the law too? And so what we're hoping to do today too is to make an example of this organization, to say, if you violate campaign finance laws, you're going to be held accountable to the public. If you try to hide your contributions, you're going to be held accountable. And that's the other part of this, is that the reason these penalties are so high is because of part of the law that we created, where we tried to increase the amount of penalties. If you look through it right now, most of the penalties are pretty weak. I mean, let's look at the penalty for filing a late. It's $5 a day. For actually filing a false report, it's only $3,000. But this penalty on failing to disclose certain contributions, we specifically made that very high because of the concerns of that groups are going to start finding holes in the campaign finance system as a way to hide money through the process.
Mike, are you sure that Win Minnesota is a C4 organization and not a 527 organization?
Well, this is the complex nature of everything, is that they're actually both.
Well, then which is it?
No, you can, this is the whole, I mean, you may know this. Campaign finance issues are very complicated.
Okay, so if they're both, are they in
No,
violation of
they're
the law?
two separate organizations though. So they're considered two very separate organizations. So you can be, Common Cause is a 501c4. We're also a 501c3. And we could be a 527 if we want to. You have different boards. You have this. I'm not making it up. This is the whole system that's been created.
But the side that deals with the money, or that deals with the money that we're talking about here, is that the 527 side or the C4 side with Minnesota?
The way that they tend to do it is that the money will come to basically the C4 side. Then that C4 side will give to other C4 organizations and then some political organizations. When they tend to give to the political side, the money goes to the 527
Well, that
organization.
seems like a devious and deliberate attempt to avoid transparency.
But again, the issue here is that is legal. And unfortunately, the way that campaign finance laws have worked over the last few years is that groups have spent, and lawyers have spent a lot of time trying to find loopholes in the system.
Even if they're registered as a 527,
Yep.
it's legal
Yes.
for them because they're also registered as a C4.
Yes.
So Win Minnesota just basically did a better job.
Win Minnesota is following the law.
So they basically did a better job in terms of making sure that water found the cracks.
I mean, yeah.
And why should a voter who's worried about the economy, unemployment, state budget, care about the nuances of this, whether Win Minnesota did a better job than Minnesota's Future in terms of disclosing or hiding this money?
I mean, I think the issue is back to the disclosure law and making sure it's enforced. Because if we start to say, hey, this really isn't that big a deal, we start to not enforce this law, you're going to see even larger efforts to try to find those cracks in the system. And basically, it makes the disclosure law worth nothing. And the problem we have right now is our system is getting flooded with all these contributions, whether it be union, whether it be corporate. And my concern is that it's drowning out the voice of average Minnesotans. And so when it comes time is that you're seeing all this new money coming in, the public has a right to know who's spending that money, who's trying to influence their elected officials. And if the public doesn't know, I don't think they can make sort of informed decisions about who to support. And what concerns me is, a voter that is concerned about the economy is that what special interests are going to tell them during that candidate during the legislative session to go a certain way, and that may be no longer in their best interest as a citizen. And so I think if you look at the polling too, Minnesotans are largely concerned with the system and that they believe it's largely run by these special interest groups.
Is the organization against whatever allows Win Minnesota to do the same thing? Is that something that you want to see change?
That's part of the whole express advocacy thing. That again, I sent out a press release about NOM, that everyone is exploiting right now. So you see all sides exploiting the express advocacy component.
You mentioned that, I know this is getting kind of deep in the weeds, but you just mentioned that all politicians who are in the legislature or the governor are going to be influenced by these special interests. At the same time, they can't figure out who the special interests are.
Oh, they know though.
So you're.
I think it's pretty clear that they know who's behind these organizations. And the RGA knows who its donors are. The RGA will talk to their candidate and exert influence that way.
Isn't that kind of making a leap that you're saying the RGA,
But again, it's going back to the public has a right to know who's spending the money. And right now, they're violating the law.
But as I don't think I understood your answer before. Win Minnesota is doing, they're doing it within the laws, you're saying, but there's also this loophole that they've figured out, or whatever it is. Is that something that, do you have a problem with that?
Yes, and we pushed for legislation this year, and the Chamber of Commerce opposed it. And that's why it's not in the bill that passed this year. Because what that bill basically did is it required any group that engages in express advocacy during election time, so basically 90 days before the primary through the general election, to also disclose any expenditures or contributions it's receiving, if it's engaging in political activity, basically. So you see these ads, whether it's from Win Minnesota or the National Organization for Marriage, they're spending money on this election, and they don't have to disclose a single thing. And so it's concerning that there's a clear intent to influence election. Let's go back to NOM as a perfect example. NOM is running their advertisements right now to basically call for a referendum. When did they start running those ads? After the legislative session ended. Well, I lobby a lot, and that's not the time when you start making a legislative push, and when legislators are out the door. You start it in January, and you start running ads then. And so it shows that the clear intent with those ads is to influence the outcome of the election. And so, yes, we have to close this loophole right now. Both sides are exploiting it, but with this election, there's not much I can do about that right now. So I'm focused on just enforcing the laws that exist in the books. And if I don't do that, then it makes all the other work that I'm going to be doing completely worthless.
You just said that Win Minnesota's putting ads up, but they're actually not. They're giving money to another group that's putting the ads up, and isn't that even more confusing?
But it would be those groups, whether it be Planned Parenthood or another labor organization, if they were doing this type of express advocacy during the election, that group would then have to disclose. So yes.
Do you believe that the National Organization for Marriage is trying to influence the election?
I think it's clear. I think anyone looks at that ad, stands back and says, yes, they're trying to influence the election. They're talking negatively about particular candidates. They're talking positively about others. And so, and this is an issue that happened at the federal level. McCain-Feingold was all about sort of dealing with this. And what the lawsuit with Citizens United actually did was we had a ban on this type of sort of soft money contributions in the system. But what happens is that I think any communication like that that's trying to do express advocacy around election time is clearly trying to influence the elector.
You said you've asked for an expedited hearing before the Campaign Finance Board. Any idea when that might be?
Their next meeting, I believe, is either Tuesday or Wednesday. The board will have the complaint before them, and from there they'll develop a schedule on when they hear it.
The complaint's been filed.
Yes, it has. And again, we've also sent a letter to the City Attorney of St. Paul asking her to investigate. because there's criminal prosecution as part of this.
Have any of these groups given to your organization?
Given to my organization? No.
In general, is there an unusual amount of chaos in the campaign finance rules because of Citizens United during this cycle?
I mean, there was, but that's why we tried to pass the disclosure law. So there were significant concerns that if we did not pass that disclosure law in Minnesota, that there would be that chaos, because it would be unclear how independent expenditure groups can get money or what sort of level of disclosure. So I would say it could have been much worse. There still is some regarding this because it is sort of a brave new world and groups are also trying to push the limits. Unfortunately, within campaign finance, groups are always trying to push the limits. And so that's why we're also filing this now, is to sort of say, this type of activity is not okay.
So you wouldn't attribute this to any uncertainty about what the rules are?
No, they knew what they were doing. I mean, again, this is a purposeful sort of activity of creating an LLC to sort of hide that. You don't, by accident, go out and create another organization.
Why the city of St. Paul?
They have jurisdiction over this.
Over who?
Because of basically both the circumvention aspects are a gross misdemeanor, and gross misdemeanors would go to cities instead of counties. So if you look at, I can pull up the statute, but violation of that is a $3,000 fine, and it's considered a gross misdemeanor. So there are criminal aspects of the law, which is another important reason why we're doing this, is to, again, send a clear message. You violate the law, you're going to jail, you're going to face significant penalties. Other questions? Great. Thank you.
Well, I've got you all here. My name is Chris Tiedemann. I am the chairman of Minnesota's Future Independent Expenditure Committee. Yeah, it's Chris Tiedemann. Do you need a spelling on that? T-I-E-D-E-M-A-N. We consulted with the Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board when we heard that a complaint had been filed. We sort of anticipated it may be about us. And we are confident that we have filed everything appropriately, and I think we'll find that relatively quickly. We organized as both an independent expenditure committee and as a separate 527. Minnesota's Future LLC organizes a 527 as well, because with regard to the 527, it's because there's a requirement that you register with the IRS. But it allows us to participate here in Minnesota's elections as an independent expenditure committee. Minnesota's Future LLC, their purpose as a 527 is stated to participate in both state and federal elections, issue advocacy, lobbying, and so forth on other important issues that are important to the future of Minnesota. They are required to register as a 527 if they're going to participate in those other activities. According to Minnesota law, there is nothing illegal, nothing improper about contributions going from an LLC to an independent expenditure committee, which is what we are. We followed the letter of the law. Even if the Republican Governors Association had given their $428,000 contribution directly to our independent expenditure committee, they would not have had to have submitted the disclosure form revealing their member donors, because the threshold for the contributions must be more than $1,000 per member. There's no reporting requirement if the pro rata, that's per contributor, contributions are less than $1,000, and the RGA has more than 428 members, and so this issue is just simply moot. I think it's rather humorous. This is the second time that Common Cause has overstepped. Most of you didn't report on it last week when they filed a complaint suggesting we didn't report at all, which was simply false. And we find it ironic that they're attacking our organization with a frivolous complaint when the DGA, Win Minnesota, Win Minnesota's Political Action Fund, the Alliance for a Better Minnesota, did essentially the same thing with one additional step. Yes, there are two Win Minnesotas, and yes, they are Win Minnesota. At least one of them is a 527. I can show you that paperwork. I guess I would submit that it's clear that Common Cause is simply a DFL front group trying to shut down our legitimate right to participate in this political process, which should be done with more speech, not less, and certainly not with lawsuits and frivolous complaints. I'd like to hand out this to you all. This compares the Republican Governors Association's participation and the Democratic Governors Association's participation. If I could just hand this out to you. And this is what you were discussing a little bit earlier. It's essentially the same thing. I also, for your sake, want to hand out two other items for you. One is the flow of money with Alliance for a Better Minnesota, Win Minnesota, the 2010 fund, a variety of members of the Mark Dayton family, for you to take a look at. And lastly, the comparable flow chart for our contribution. So if you look at the chart, you'll see that the contributions flow similarly to the way they flow on the Republican side. The first chart, the simplified chart that compares the two. The DGA has contributed to Win Minnesota. Win Minnesota gave to Win Minnesota Political Action Fund, and the Political Action Fund for Win Minnesota is given to the Alliance for a Better Minnesota, which has spent just shy of $3 million in independent expenditures as of the last report. The Republican Governors Association contributed $428,000 to Minnesota's Future LLC. Minnesota's Future, prior to the last reporting period, which has contributed $429,500 to Minnesota's Future Independent Expenditure Committee, which is my organization, and prior to the September 21st report, we had spent in independent expenditures in this campaign $408,924. The funny thing is that the flow chart that you see with regard to the DGA contributions was available on their reports on the July 13th report, and oddly enough, we didn't see anything out of Common Cause until just now. They waited until the September reports to attack our side, which they disagree with politically, and the Democrats did the same thing. Frankly, it's a joke. We're confident that the complaint will be dismissed, just as their last frivolous complaint was, we anticipate, has been dismissed. We haven't even been officially informed about it, as they jumped the gun last week. And we just anticipate that they will drop this as well. Once again, Common Cause has their facts wrong. They're just simply wrong on this. And I guess I would submit that that with all their discussion of disclosure, I mean, we don't know who contributes to them. I do have, and I only have one copy of this, and I apologize. Their 2008 reports. Now they'll say they're a 501c4, and that's fine. But if you're going to have this discussion and exist for the reason they do, and I'll give you all a chance to look at this. But you see contributions of, you know, 12,500, 15,000, 10,000, 75,000. The name, address, zip code, etc. is just blank. So they are certainly inconsistent in this respect. So we're confident that they'll quickly dismiss these complaints. I take a few questions, Sue.
How was Minnesota's Future LLC created?
Minnesota's Future LLC is a 527. They exist because they will participate over time in both state and federal elections, issue advocacy, lobbying, and other both state and federal issues, they were required by law to exist as a 527. So that's why they've been set up.
Common Cause asserts that it was formed at the timing of its formation was after the backlash as a way to hide the donors.
All of our donors will be disclosed. In fact, those that will be those that have given to the I believe that the Republican Governors Association has to disclose their contributors in October. So I mean he's just reaching.
Yeah, the timing of it was not to circumvent the law?
No.
And why didn't Ministers Future LLC register with the Campaign Finance Board, or did they have to?
They're not required to.
So you're saying that they filed the LLC because they're gonna, at one point, get involved in the federal issues, federal races?
The purpose of their organization is to participate in both state and federal elections, to do issue advocacy, which is a whole different animal, to do lobbying, which is a whole different animal, and they were required by law to file as a 527. We are a 527 as well. The 527 is a political catch-all with the IRS. If you exist as an entity, you have to be something with the IRS. We're a 527. Minnesota Future is a 527. As I showed you, Win Minnesota exists as a 527 and a 501c4 and who knows what else.
But as of now, the only thing that they've been involved with.
To my knowledge, yeah.
To you.
That actually, I don't know that for sure, but I believe that to be the case. I'm the chair of the Independent Expenditure Committee.
To what
So.
extent is there coordination between the Minnesota Future Independent Expenditure, the political committee, and the LLC? They have the same name, so that's why I asked,
Well, they've contributed to us.
Is it housed in the same office, or?
No, we have our address is up in Lionel Lakes, and I believe the Minnesota's Future LLC is out in Oakdale.
You guys share treasurers, though, right?
No,
You don't share?
no, no. All of our paper. Oh, there's been no staff. I'm volunteering, at least to this point.
Well, is there any overlap, I guess, in other words?
Well, we talk. Yeah, I mean, the LLC's been raising money and they've been contributing to us. So I mean, of course, we communicate.
And are you raising money specifically for the IE side?
We're always trying to raise money to participate in this election, and if as we do, we'll either put it on the air as an Independent Expenditure Committee or direct mail or some other voter communication.
I guess let me ask this. Have you raised money from any other group besides the LLC?
I'm going to have to go to our treasurer on that. We hadn't prior to the last report.
Chris,
Yeah,
these
Martika.
two groups both have, Win Minnesota and Lines for Better Minnesota both have entities that then they give to their political independent expenditure groups.
I can't follow that flow chart.
But is that similar to what Minnesota's Future LLC is with Minnesota?
Oh, I don't think with regard to this, I don't think either of us did anything improper. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying what we did is the same thing.
You mean the Alliance side and the...
Correct.
Minnesota Future.
Which is why he couldn't answer your questions. Any other questions? I appreciate it. If you want to see Common Cause's report, I have it right here. Thank you.